As we settle into our course, I'm kind of doing some wind up with some context. And so today I'm going to, last time we met, I spent much of the time in a little divergence of how we'll usually come together lecturing about the reign of Peter or 2 meetings ago, right? And then today, what I want to do is I'm going to lecture more or less about this period from the death of Peter into the 19th century. So, and what we're doing here is kind of getting some background because as we stay in for many, many weeks in the 19th century and we listen to how these people wrangle over how to form a society, what Russia is, what the West is, what's Russia's relationship to the West, we very much get the gist, the point, as a point that you've already encountered in the readings we've had so far, that Peter's reign casts a very long shadow and has a massive legacy in terms of how Russians understand. I mean, was he just great, great, great and did all this modernizing Russia needed to do? Or um, did he move so fast and so fierce that he broke Russia um, because he set it on a trajectory that it just wasn't ready to be on in a way that separated nobility from the people and that is something, as you'll see today, that maybe Catherine even exacerbated. If Peter was enthralled with the West and he loved the Netherlands probably more than any other country because they had such a great navy, and so Peter learned some Dutch. He was Then we had more Germans coming in, as you'll hear. And so Germanic language came to the Russian court. But in the 18th century, Catherine was so enthralled by the French philosophes, Voltaire and Diderot, that Catherine got very good at French. Born as she was a Lutheran German, Catherine got very good at French, and she had the nobilities speak French. And so by the time you get to the reading that you are coming today, so the next reading we have is not a primary source, but it's a secondary source reading. And it's this long chapter written from this book called Natasha's Dance, A Cultural History of Russia by an English historian. And you're reading this chapter, Children of 1812, which is telling this story of how the officer class learned lessons of interacting with the peasants in the War of 1812 that made them so disenchanted with the state of things that they started to play with the idea, fatal for 5 of them, of how to make change. That's a little bit ahead of our story, but so my hope is that at the end of my comments today, there's still going to be kind of a gap between the reigns of Paul and Alexander, but you'll have a sense of what happens post Peter. What's the story of the 18th century? And this is all setting us up to kind of then really pause as we get into the 19th century and reading more closely these texts about a whole variety of isms that people develop. Okay, so today we are going to look a bit at a family tree. Peter died in 1825. He died on February 8th, 1825. He had actually, even though he was the robust son compared to his half-brother, Peter had health problems throughout his life. He had this nervous tic that was mentioned, and I read to you in a quotation from an observer at court. He was that may have been associated with seizures that he could have had throughout his life, and he got very sick. And it's said that in November he was up. So he was up in the north, and that a sailor had fallen into the sea, and that Peter dived in to help save him. I don't know if this is true or not, but it has been that Peter, this is the story, that he was saving a fellow sailor, and he did have something quite egalitarian about him, and that he caught a chill in November. And it may or may not have been directly related, but so he kind of got sick, got better, got sick, very sick in January. And then by January, he was quite ill. And he'd been sick before, so it wasn't clear if this was really the end or not to people around him, but he did not pull out of it. And doctors have been it's unclear if he died from a urinary tract infection ultimately, or if it might have been some sort of venereal disease, maybe gonorrhea. But at any rate, Peter passed away February 8th, 1725. He's the first Russian Tsar to be buried outside of Moscow in the Cathedral of St. Peter and Paul, which was still under construction at the time. And someday, if we have some time, I have a little video of a friend of mine base jumping out of Peter and Paul Cathedral. It really offers a different perspective, but it is definitely not something for you to ever try. And he had to run to not be arrested by it. It was featured on the Russian news, and he has since escaped from Russia and is jumping off of mountains in Arco, Italy. But anyway, that's a side point. So here, we're going to look at some family trees that I think you can all see this. This is this is the Romanov, this is a genealogy chart of the Romanov dynasty. And the names that I have circled are from Johann. Well, we'll come back to this, and this will be posted. You'll get a chance to see it. But the small point is that the czars that we'll talk about today go back to Peter's half-brother, right? I told you in the first time, Peter had a half-brother who was incapacitated for rule, but did bear children. And it is those children that they will follow that genealogical line to get the next czars. But pretty much, we'll kind of basic outlines. Who rules Russia after Peter and between Catherine? So Peter dies in 1725. His wife becomes Empress of Russia. This is an entirely norm-busting event. We're going to tell the story of Catherine the Great, Catherine II, as a sort of how unexpected that this minor German princess ends up being the Tsarina of Russia. But I would say that the story of how Catherine I becomes the Tsarina of Russia is potentially even more amazing. Catherine I was probably born under the name Martha Skravonskaya, probably Lutheran or some peasant, perhaps a serf. And in the course of the Great War and the fighting over there in the Baltics, she gets captured and ends up in the house as a servant girl of one of a Russian retinue. Servant girls in the early modern period had little in the way of legal rights, and it was very frequent that their domestic masters required sexual favors from them as well. Martha Skravonska was a beautiful woman, and this is no doubt the fate that she knew. She ended up in the household of, I think, Menshikov, where Peter noticed her on visiting on a drunken night. And he would insist that she walked him back to his room at night and escorted him with a candle. And that wasn't all of it. But Peter fell in love with her and he married her. He had been married to, a proper family. He had been married to a proper wife that he didn't love, and he managed to send her to a monastery. And then he had a years-long affair with Catherine. She was baptized into Russia. They were married in 1712. Their first child, Elizaveta, had been born in 1709. So just get that. They had an illegitimate child, a child born out of wedlock who will become Tsarina of Russia. That's Elizaveta Petrovna. But Peter marries her, and they have a long relationship. Peter loves her deeply. And although that doesn't mean he is faithful to her, both of them engage in infidelities. But they have many children together, and eh, they they have several children together. The son passes away, so he doesn't. The son passes away, but he has two daughters that survive. In the last months of life, they were estranged. This got very complicated because in 1724, Peter made a declaration about royal succession. So it turns out in all of Russian history, from the end of the Civil War, where we sort of say we can now see the start of the Muscovite state in the 1460s, and the rest of the dynasty that was called the Danilovich-Rurikid dynasty, there is no hard and fast rule of succession. They try to move to according to primogeniture, more or less. There are some exceptions, but in large part, it's primogeniture, where that means the throne passes to the firstborn son. But even so, one issue, lots of exceptions, but the other issue is there's no real law about it, and nor among the Romanovs. And so Peter makes this decree. He is very much a state builder. I am the state. The state is so, but I am the first servant of the state. Everyone must serve the state, including me, but I get to say what happens because I'm the czar. And he says the czar declares who's going to be the successor, and he declares that Catherine is going to be the successor. So this is completely unprecedented. She is not, I mean, I've just told you about her background. At any rate, May 1724, they read the coronation decree. No one really thought this would be a mandate for her to rule independently. And then also in the last 3 months of Peter's life, they were very estranged. Catherine was having an affair with Wilhelm Mons, who was the brother of Anna Mons. Peter had an affair with Anna Mons, as a matter of fact, but Peter was interested in no such reciprocity, and he had William Mons brutally executed in public. The official charge was that he was embezzlement, but he was drawn and quartered in November 1724. So some people were like, gee, they are so on the outs. Does he really want her to be Tsarina? And there's a little bit that Peter passes away. It's like I said, it's a little bit unexpected, but there's enough of a faction led first and foremost by Menshikov, that with some guards, he takes her, and Catherine becomes the Tsarina of Russia from 1725 to 1727. So she's got a very short rule, and she's not really calling the shots. She's not interested in calling the shots. I mean, she was a woman with a strong personality. It's even said that Peter, when he was on campaign, he really wanted letters from her, and she really did have sway with him. So she was a woman with a strong personality, but she was not made to rule. She had no interest in ruling. And Menshikov, Peter's right-hand man, made sure that she didn't have to deal with it too much. Menshikov had been also not from nobility, a pie seller in the German quarter that had become friends with Peter, and then rises to, his close advisor. He stays in Petersburg. He's not an army guy. He becomes filthy rich, and he has an awful lot of enemies. So Menshikov, there's a lot of people that don't like Menshikov um, that much as well, and that probably contributes to him um, ending up in exile in Siberia. But anyway, so Catherine has a short rule. She inaugurates almost 70 years of almost continuous rule by women over the Russian Empire, which is a fairly remarkable occurrence. And we'll kind of walk through each of these particular, that wasn't part of the plan at all, but circumstances played out such that that's what happened. Um, in 1726, they establish a Supreme Privy Council that is going to do the actual ruling. So effectively, we have the establishment of oligarchy, oligarchical rule. And under Catherine, surprisingly, this is Peter's wife, run by Peter's right-hand man, the Supreme Privy Council actually started undoing some of the reforms. They lowered the poll tax that Peter had included, and I'm going to pause here to just make a distinction that's going to come up in some of our other readings. When you read about the Slavophiles, you're going to read about how they were enamored of the Obshchina, the collective Russian village, which was, and they just find this to be the organic, true way that life should function. This is the most pure manifestation of Russianness. Well, under Romanov rule, they did collect taxes from state villages where the duty was the village had to pony up a certain amount of either grain or cash. More often it was in kind. In some circumstances, it could be rule. In some cases, it could be even labor. But basically, the unit that the state saw and interacted with was the village. And it was village elders, the old elders of the village, that led the village. And villages got led variously. And some villages had very cruel elders maybe at a time, and it varied. But what Peter comes along and he says, we're going to have a poll tax. We are going to, like a modern state, we are going to count the people, and every male is going to pay an individual poll tax. That's what modern states do. That's what we're going to do. And when they first initiated the poll tax, it was probably a little bit it was heavy enough that it caused a lot of friction. And so they lowered the poll tax. They also downsized the administration slightly. Peter grew government tremendously, and it is unclear to this day to what effect it all had. And so there was this kind of shaving down of some shaving down of the poll tax, some shaving down of government, and there was also Peter had a son who was still alive. He was born in 1715. And so when Catherine passed away after a brief illness in May of 1727, she's only been tsarina for 2 years. There's a faction that wants Peter's son, to be czar. And it's not a hard sell. I mean, this is more or less how things have worked. And so we have the reign of Peter the First. And here is, I just wanted to move it down, show you a picture of, so here is a pendant that was done of Peter and Catherine and their son, Pyotr. And then also they have, so when their son Pyotr, this is just their son Pyotr, and you would think, oh, it's their other daughters. No, it's not their daughters. It's the allegorical faith, truth, and justice are included in the family. So that sort of shows this intention that Peter's wasn't necessarily planning for his son to, wasn't planning for his daughter to succeed him ultimately. He was planning for his son. He died quite early. He was, 54 or so? So he died earlier than expected. The children that they had were Anna, Elizabeth will become the future czar, be Empress Elizabeth, and then they had a son, Peter, who who passed away, and then Natalie, who also passed away the same year that her son did. Um, Now, before I tell you about the son of Peter that did become czar very briefly, I'm going to just no less briefly tell you this very, very sad story about Peter's son that didn't become czar. Peter, as I mentioned, had a first marriage. And for that marriage, he had a son, and they named the son Alexei. He was Alexei Petrovich. And Alexei Petrovich um, lived from 1690 to 1718. And to make a long story short, he was a huge disappointment to Peter. And so his mother gets, summarily removed and sent to a monastery. And he is surrounded, and Peter, even during his reign, had many enemies, people that he was called the Antichrist, after all, and there made some sense to it. One of his right-hand men, Andre Vinius, who was in charge of metallurgy and supplying the army, went around to churches in Russia and melted down their church bells to pour them into cannon. I mean, in terms of like the symbolism in a very religious country, this is how one gets a reputation, Antichrist. And so I mean, we celebrate Peter now. We read Lomonosov's panegyric to him, but there are people that were like, this guy is the devil. And some of them really surrounded themselves with Alexei. They got close to Alexei and they talked to him about traditional views and a proper Orthodox way of living. And maybe even in here we could really see the signs of a kind of anti-Westernism. Those things that Peter's doing are not part of our traditions. And Alexei, it remains a bit unclear to this day if he was truly, what he would have done. But he did associate with people who were enemies of Peter. He didn't develop in the kind of manly, martial battlefield ways. Peter loved military things and war, and Alexei was not going in that direction so much. He was married to an Austrian. And so to make a long story short, Peter and Alexei have a troubled relationship in any case. And then Alexei flees to Austria. He was married against his will. He said she's pimply and skinny and I don't like her. But to this Austrian princess, he goes to Austria. Peter sends some of his right-hand retinue after them, and they get him back. He is brought back to St. Petersburg and he is arrested for treason. He is kept in prison. And you have this moment where Peter says kind of, I am the state, we're a modern state, and we are going to have the council make the decision on this. And everyone in the council, kind of like the cowed congressional members of, our Congress today, no one is going to make a decision. They're all like, what does the leader want? What does the leader want? And while we're in this limbo of, are we going to make the call to execute the son of the czar? What does the czar want? And it's a little bit unclear, but basically, he is subjected to a number of torture sessions, and he either succumbs in a torture session or is murdered. It's a little bit unclear, but a government body never has to make the final decision on whether they're going to execute him or not, because he dies on one of those in the wake of one of those torture systems. But to be clear, Peter could have at any moment said, this is my son. I'll deal with this, between us or something like that. And he did not. Many historians think that Peter made peace with having his own son die, that his project of modernizing the state was the most important thing to his identity, and that he potentially saw his son as someone that would thwart, reverse that, and he knew where his loyalties were. So that's the story of Alexei Petrovich. He got married. He also has two kids. Sorry. Peter's, yeah, oh gosh. So his son, so he gets married 1715. He has two children, and it is his son that is Peter the second, not Peter's first son. Peter's first son passed away. All this genealogy stuff is quite confusing, can be confusing. You don't really need to know this, but I do want to kind of bob and weave through some of the complicatedness, and you will make of it what you will. So here is a late 19th century picture of done by a Russian artist of Peter interrogating his son Alexei when he was brought back from Austria. Here is a picture of Empress Catherine I, 2-year rule, but really it's Menshikov who is ruling things. Here is a portrait of Menshikov, pie seller turned richest man in Russia, and boy did he make enemies along the way. This is Menshikov's palace, which is still in St. Petersburg. It's right next to St. Petersburg University now. Museum houses some of those things, but it was probably the best mansion as Petersburg is getting built up. It's founded in 1703, and Peter is in my first book, I studied one of the merchant families I study. They get the decree, you must build an estate in Peter's new city. I am calling you to the court, is what happened to a lot of noble people. So no one wanted to go there except Peter. And now there is a whole city there. This is Menshikov's palace, which was far more glorious and glamorous than even where Peter himself lived. Here are some. So here is Peter Alexeyevich. So Peter Alexeyevich, born 1715. He is the grandson of Peter and the son of Peter's estranged and killed son, Alexei Petrovich, who just dies when he's only 3 years old. So she passes away. Menshikov has tons of enemies, and he gets sent into exile in Siberia. He is out of the picture. And now Peter II comes to the throne. His coronation is planned his coronation is going to happen in February of 1727. This is months after. His mom dies in May. He's kind of the czar, but the big coronation ceremony, there's some time before that happens when they get it all ready, et cetera, et cetera. Even before he's coronated, Menshikov is already sent off to exile and will die in the Siberian town of Berezov in 1729. So Peter's coronated. He's still a fairly young czar, but he is betrothed to be married. He's going to get married to the daughter of a very powerful, long-standing Russian family, Peter Dolgoruki, who's like the arch enemy of Menshikov, really hated him. So now we're seeing we can kind of read this as like, hey, some more traditional forces are coming back to the center. But before that and so he's slated to be married on January 30th, 1730. He's only 14 at this point. It's going to be it's a very early marriage. We're going to get things in place. And unfortunately, he died of smallpox on his wedding day. So he doesn't get married. And then this short reign of the grandson of Peter the Great, the child of his son, is out of the picture quite early. Now, I know. So what have we kind of looked at? So now we've sort of Ivan IV. So yeah, here we had Peter the Great is over here. Peter the Great is over here. And he has with his first wife, Lapukhina, Alexei Petrovich. Alexei Petrovich is married to this Austrian Princess Charlotte, and they have Peter, who will be Peter II, but he passes away. This over here with his second wife, Catherine, these are their children, only I think 2 of which survive to adulthood. One of them is going to be Empress Elizabeth. But what happens in the meantime? Okay, this is where it gets really complicated, and only if you ever find yourself in a Russophilic cocktail party. You could really score points if you know this story, but don't worry too much about the line. But um, there's one other grandson, Karl Peter Ulrich, and he was born in 1728 to Anna Petrovna. Anna Petrovna is one of the girls that Peter and Catherine, his wife Catherine, had. So there's two girls. Anna Petrovna is one of them, and they married him off to this Germanic prince, and he has a son. He is going to grow up. He's going to be Tsar Peter the III, but we're not even ready for him yet. So what happens in 1730? In 1730, now we have, someone that's direct in the dynastic line, but he's passed away super early. What are we going to do? Well, we go back to this family tree, and it turns out that Peter's half-brother, Ioan, so Alexei Mihailovich, has all these children, and one of them is Ioan Alexeyevich, or Ivan V, actually, who has a daughter. And his daughter was Anna Ioanovna. And she's the daughter of Ioan, who'd been co-czar, unhealthy, died in 1696. She was born in 1693, and she'd been married off to this Duke of Holstein. So she's kind of off in the Baltics. And he died in 1711. So she's been a widow off in the Baltic state all by herself. And at the Supreme Privy Council, they're like, okay, we've had some female rule. We have someone that's in the legitimate bloodline. She's kind of docile and not that uneducated, probably. Let's get her. So you have these old Russian boyar families like Dolgoruki. It was his daughter that was going to marry Peter II. He had this like great plan to be close to power, foiled by smallpox. So then they go and they get her. They're like, hey, come back and be the rightful tsarina of Russia. So she's wasn't really having a very happy life out there. So she's glad to be called back to the place of her pretty happy childhood. So she arrives to St. Petersburg. And there are all these factions that are starting to form. And so some people are like, oh my gosh, if Dolgoruki calls back Anna Ioanovna, she's going to be like his creatures. And we other, rich noble families that have had a say in things are going to be totally shunted to the side and get nowhere. We can't let this fly. And so some of these folks, as she's coming back into St. Petersburg, she's approached and they say, look, welcome to Russia. We think that in order to have good government, there needs to be certain conditions on the czar. That's a more modern way to do things. So in other words, they're like willing to encroach on autocracy, not because they're so committed to freedom. And who is involved in these power plays? This is like the elite. This is the oligarchy, pretty much. That part of the oligarchy thinks they're going to get their piece of the pie a little bit gypped, and they want to maneuver to make that not happen, right? So don't mistake the fashionable competitive politics that's happening here for representatives of the people, a la Martin Luther King Jr. or something in that vein. This is like people competing for influence where the power is. And so, but they say, okay, we're going to have these conditions, not because they're thinking that autocracy in theory should be limited. They don't want the Supreme Privy Council to be making calls that they don't like. So they kind of position themselves as being progressive, but they're worried about their piece of the pie. Here I'm editorializing greatly. But anyway, so they say, here, we'll have these conditions. And she's sort of like, well, and doesn't really give an answer, suggests that she will comply. But then in the meantime, the Dolgoruki clan, they find out about this and they're like, oh, no, you don't. No, you don't. You don't need to do that. You're going to be Tsarina. And so basically, there's this public ceremony where, according to some laid out plan in advance, they have presented her with the conditions that she will sign. And in this public ceremony, and basically the conditions are these. One, we will not start a war with anybody. We will not conclude peace. Oh, this is the royal we, by the way. That she must not conclude peace on her own. She must not burden her faithful subjects with new taxes. And she will. And then gets to the rub too. All that stuff, you're like, well, that sounds reasonable and kind of decent. We will not promote anybody to high rank above the rank of colonel without certain conditions. And appointing the high military ranks has to remain under the control of the Supreme Privy Council. And then they say they will not deprive members of the nobility of life possessions or honor without a court of law. We will not grant that she wouldn't just grant villages to people. The way it used to work is if the Tsar would show their favor, they just had much of the land was theirs, and they would say, okay, now it's yours. And then a noble would get this village that was full of serfs that would farm the land and deliver it up to the noble so that they could have a wealthy lifestyle as such. And actually, the nobility don't really pay taxes in the way that even the poll tax called on them to pay. Of course, they have to pay. You have to pay to play at court. And when there's a war, you're voluntold to pony up all kinds of nice things to the state. So, I mean, that's a kind of whole complicated milieu that scholars continue to try and sort out, who pays what in that follow the money sense. But at any rate, it's a very different tax structure, and that the nobility have it so good on the backs of the majority of serfs is one of the conditions that makes it really hard for Russia to truly mobilize by having a free, mobile labor force. It is very hard to convince someone to do something that, the majority, that their income depends on them not doing, right? So, but yeah, serfdom, other big conversation. We'll talk about that stuff. But so this moment in 19, and then so they're not going to grant villages, and a lot of the conditions are about, rank, that you have all these people that are already the haves that don't want their piece of the pie encroached upon, is the way I understand the dynamics of what's happening here in large part. So, and limits on what she can spend in terms of state revenue. So those are essentially the conditions, all like reasonable enough sounding stuff. But then you also get these people are really concerned with rank, that so much of it does concern rank promotions of other people. And so basically Anna gives the impression she's going to go along and then says no, and tears it up in this public setting. And she tears up the conditions, and she declares herself empress and self-upholder of all Russia, which is the kind of autocratic tradition that had been building. So, like, basically, we'll look back over our course and we'll say, when do we start to see modernizing characteristics, if we want to associate it with modernizing, of limiting czarist power? 1730 is one of those moments as they're bringing in dynastically appropriate, but kind of been out of the game for a really long time, Anna Ivanovna. So they bring her in, and with one faction planning to limit it because they think that Dolgoruki, if he's just a direct line to her, they're going to get screwed under her rulership, and it doesn't fly. So then she is tsarina for a decade. We have a decade of Anna Ivanovna's rule, and they say this is a mix of a continuation and a departure of Petrine rule. I don't want to totally diss her rule. One of the things that does seem to happen is a cultivation of the secret police. There's a lot of spying on people that might cause problems, and people in noble ranks, even, not some not going to go into details, but of like lower noble ranks. So you could be at court, you could be in the retinue that attends to this princess or that princess, etc. I think nearly 3,000 such people are sent into exile in Siberia during Anna's reign because they have been had some untoward conversation or this or that. The untoward conversation, the secret police, they will read mail with abandon. I mean, this is the age of there are holes in the walls and palaces where people are listening to each other and nobility trying to double cross each other. There's some of these series or whatnot that have those sorts of moments. Yes, there are holes in the walls in to royal chambers in 18th century Russian palaces that people are peeping through to overhear conversations and things like that. So when you look back, if as me as an institutionalist being like, what are the institutions? What are the checks and balances? How do they work? I would say like, wow, we can count these people. Thousands of people are getting sent that are people with like some privilege and property are getting sent to Siberia because they have displeased someone. So that so in terms of kind of civil rights, innocent until proven guilty, that doesn't seem to be all that operative here. But there's another way that her reign has been mostly talked about, and that is as the Bironovshina. Bironovshina. So Anna's rule, she is a widow. She's not married and doesn't get married again, so she has no official issue. She was rumored to have a lover, Ernst Johann Byron, and for that reason, her rule is sort of like the rule of Byron, Bironovshina. Um, and you start to have people saying, look at this outside German. We're real Russians. He shouldn't be here. He shouldn't be telling us what to do. He's appointing way too many of his people to high government posts. And there's this sort of buzz around her court. People have looked back and said, like, you know what, actually, the percentage of Germans in the court under her doesn't really change. There'd already been lots of foreigners in pretty high roles in the Russian court, even since the 17th century. So that is really not, so that seems to not hold up to just the scrutiny of counting personnel positions, but it was the gist and the feel. So we might say this is a moment where you start to see people being like, these aren't real Russians. Why are real Rossiyskis? Why are they having, so much power in this government? That's a vibe that's going on. And it is also probably informed by this preconception that, well, a woman doesn't really rule in her own right, so it's got to be someone else pulling the strings. I won't go on too much. All right, so other points. Russia gave up some territory in the south on her watch. She had that bit yeah, not even Azov, but basically kind of, and I'm making this point to say that if Peter was really aggressive, he is trying to take territory that Russia can't hold. And then, so she loses some territory. She does start to, it's on her watch that they're starting to expand up the Irtysh River deeper into Central Asia. So we're seeing both, but she will pass away from kidney disease in 1740. So she has kidney disease. I think this is maybe her on her deathbed, and you definitely see these ornate rooms. I mean, this is really a period where we are starting to have tremendously ornate palaces and kind of luxury lifestyles that dwarf the kind of luxury that we saw in 17th century rulership. If you're one of those follow the money people. But at any rate, okay, 1740. Now we've just got a legitimate Romanov Tsar who has passed away without issue. What do we do now? And so here's where the bloodline gets really, really confusing. So Anna, so Anna Leopoldovna has a son that Anna Ioannovna adopts. Okay, so we're going to solve this problem through adoption. Who was Anna Leopoldovna? Anna Leopoldovna was the niece of Anna Ioannovna. She'd had a sister who had a daughter. So she's got a niece who had a son, and she adopts him. Okay. Now this niece, her name, what she'd been Tsarevna. Tsarevna means Tsar of the daughter of the Tsar. So she had been married off to Charles Leopold, the Duke of Mecklenburg. She'd been born Orthodox, baptized Orthodox, converts to Lutheranism, and she leaves Russia. Her daughter's baptized Lutheran. And then but now she's had a son, and that's the son that they are going to bring back. And this son, his name is Ivan Antonovich. Anton was his dad. He is born in 1740. So we basically have a newborn that is going to come to power. Right? So here's this little baby. He is born August 1740. He is made Tsar October 1740, and he's ousted in a coup in December 41. Because people are like, they're like, what the heck? I mean, there is a bloodline argument to be made, but now these are people that were so kind of removed from the court and unhappy with the way things are going. And here's another, oh wait, here's a picture of Empress Anna Ioannovna. Here she is with her crown, rules for a decade. When she's over, so she definitely advances more of a police state. She moves to St. Petersburg. She'd gone back to Moscow in the wake of Peter, and then she's like, all right, we'll give this St. Petersburg a try after all. So she moves back up to St. Petersburg. And then we have a succession crisis. Now, I want you to look a little bit at this map of Europe ahead of time. So this green over here is Muscovy. And then here's the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Here are lands that, pass back and forth. Up here is where we have some of these Baltic states. And I think it is no mistake that we start having all these really important marriages off to these very tiny, tiny states. It's almost a way of like neutralizing a major rivalry. You marry someone right in the bloodline to a really powerful country, they might want to start making claims. And so it seems to me it's a little bit of a policy that we have all these, Baltic marriages getting arranged. The Baltics get worked in, they become part of the Russian Empire, but they're more Germanic lands. And that's just kind of what is happening in the 19th century, to make a kind of more global comment about it. So this is the bloodline of, Johann has a daughter, Catherine, who marries Charles Leopold of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, and of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, she has Anna Leopoldovna, because the patronymic comes from your dad's name. She marries this guy, Anton Ulrich, and it's the children they have that will be Ivan the Sixth. But so here, listen to this. This is, Russian history is crazy. So he goes, yeah. So he's Tsar. He's a baby. He's like just starting to teethe when they organize a palace coup where they bring back, who do they bring back? Elizaveta Petrovna. Peter has this daughter who, A, she's a woman, B, she's a bastard child. She's born out of wedlock. But people are like, actually, maybe she'd do better. And so a palace coup in the night is organized. Like Anna Ioannovna is in bed and they come. She's like in her pajamas and they're like, come out, bear, put on your slippers and let's go. And so she is, and her four siblings are also with her at the court. And that and they pretty much put her under house arrest and they send her to Denmark. And those people more or less live happily ever after abroad. So they don't murder them. And Tsar Ivan the Sixth is put on the throne, but people are like, that's not going to fly. And so he is ousted again. Fortunately, they don't kill the baby. Sometimes they do in Russian history, as they did. They hung a 4-year-old inaugurating the first Romanov Tsar, Mikhail Fyodorovich, in 1613. Gross. Um, to editorialize a bit. As a mother, I feel entitled. And they bring in Elizaveta Petrovna. So then we're gonna have some stability. She's gonna have about a 2-decade reign, Elizaveta Petrovna. I want to come back to the fate of Ivan the Sixth, because maybe one of you will write a blockbuster Hollywood movie about it, because it's really stuff on that order. So they remove him, and they up in north of St. Petersburg, there's this Lake Ladoga, and it has an island on it, Schlüsselburg. I've actually been climbing up there and seen it. And there they build a castle and they put him in this, stone castle on this island in Lake Ladoga, not the most deserted place in the world, actually. And Lake Ladoga is quite famous in that during the siege of St. Petersburg in World War II, when it froze, they drove trucks over that ice to both move some material in and evacuate many people that were under siege by the German Nazis in St. Petersburg to safety and that on that highway of life. But anyway, so Ivan is put there in this tower in a lake with the order saying, feed him, do not educate him, do not tell him who he is. He will be alive, but nothing else. And if anyone ever comes to rescue him, kill him. And so to kind of go fast forward, that is exactly what happened. He lives out all of he lives out all of Elizaveta Petrovna's reign there. So now he's a 20-something young man, kind of raised in fairly cruel circumstances, but I mean, they're nice to him. They feed him. They maybe give him a little fresh air, but not that much, on this island fortress in Schlüsselburg. But in 1764, so this is already 2 years after Catherine II takes the throne, there's some military officers from the Mirovich family. From the Mirovich family, these are folks that had been Cossacks in the retinue of Ivan Mazepa, and then they move close to court, and so they're rising in the ranks as like military people, nowhere near nobility or anything like that. But this loyal military officer, Mirovich, hears that here we are. We've had this woman come to the throne through a coup. We're not going to stand for that. It turns out that there is a real czar. The real rightly czar is being held captive, and we are going to rescue him. So he organizes a trip to go up there to Schlüsselburg and recognize them. And the guards see these men on horseback coming that they don't know who they are, and they follow their orders and they slit Ivan VI's neck. And that is the end of him in 1764. And I'm just going to bring a side note to my own research here, is that some of the brothers have already are serving out in Siberia. Now, some of you that have taken classes with me know that I'm studying these maps from Siberia. And it's a little bit of a mystery about what, when these maps get made, da 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 da. At any rate, there's one document where this German academician says, I bought this atlas from this old guy, Mirovich. That this family Mirovich is living out in Tobolsk and they're starting to have a book collection. And so not the atlas, they sell him this chronicle. I bought this chronicle from Mirovich in like the 1730s. In 1764, this very rare, amazing atlas comes into Catherine's Hermitage collection. Just a couple months after this Mirovich, who tried to rescue Ivan VI, is executed. And here's the hypothesis that his family's property is confiscated. And that is how this atlas that I study may have ended up in the collection, the library of Catherine the Great. So that is like just a very, very small ripple, many, many points removed. But for me, I was like, wow, this is crazy. And to be confirmed, I'm working on it. But yeah, all this stuff really happened. So anyway, moving right along, the reign of Elizaveta Petrovna, I'm not going to give it justice. So it's been said, I think, I forget the historian that said it. It's in the author of The Icon and the Axe. And I think he said, if Peter built a window on the west, Elizaveta adorned it in Rococo. And she was this woman that had been raised in, court luxury, and she had developed fairly luxurious tastes. She had lots of shoes, lots of dresses, importing things from France. This is the Winter Palace that's gone through many, many, renovations, et cetera, et cetera. But this Winter Palace in St. Petersburg came to have this sort of a look. On her watch, she had the one architect, Rastrelli, doing Rococo throughout St. Petersburg. Her father built Peterhof, but he built something over there, and then she, on her reign, like upped it, Peterhof on steroids, into this very Versailles-like collection of palaces and grounds, and she would have parties. She played cards late into the night. She ate and drank with abandon. They talk about banquets where these banquets would go for hours. Maybe people would start to collect in the evening at 6 o'clock or something, and 125 different dishes would be served throughout the evening. And sometimes you would have several dishes served, and then you would get up from the table, take a turn in the garden, drinking, sit back down, keep eating. At some level, real, again, just when you think about this scene next to a serf village, one of the thoughts is, why did the revolution take so long to come at some level? And so they would have this kind of massive luxury and feasting and indulgence. Who can imagine 125 courses in one meal? I mean, and this is where you would get maybe like one bite of the soup and then pass it on and have another bite of something else. But you've got cooks and servants that are getting this all ready for the company. Here are other, some other examples of the architecture. That Smolny Institute, that is plays a role in the Russian Revolution, although it's just becomes a school for girls at this point. But so in her reign, Elizabeth, and I've sort of led with saying how she's indulgent and engages in luxury, and maybe that's not entirely fair. She isn't, like any woman at this time, there's not a lot of precedent for a woman making the shots. That said, she does put her imprint on her reign. She was a humanitarian. She made a decree to eliminate the death penalty in the Russian Empire, which before, by the way, many Western European countries had done the same. And it was largely upheld. Catherine II is going to make an exception with Pugachev, and then you're going to read about the Decembrists that are executed. So those are exceptions. But she does kind of set Russia, say, well, we're going to have this humanitarian approach to things. She is devout. She's a devout Orthodox. And this is where she loves her dad, loves Western fashions, thinks her dad was great. And the people that, say bad things about him, we don't like them. At the same time, though, she is a devout Orthodox person. And one of the things Peter did a lot to minimize the strength and power of the church. She reverses that a little bit. The church has more influence. Where we might give her quite bad marks, though, is that things get worse for religious minorities under Elizaveta. If Russia, as it starts expanding, well, the Volga is Muslim the Volga in the 9th century is ruled by a Muslim Khanate. Islam has been on the soil of what becomes Russia as long as Orthodoxy has. If the Volga Khanate of the Bulgars is there in the 800s, supposedly Volodymyr in Kiev converts to Orthodoxy in 988. And that's not even in Russia, but the Volga becomes considered Russian heartland. So Russia has had a plethora, has been a multi-confessional entity just about as long as it exists. And during those centuries of Mongol rule, that now we say, oh, the Mongols were so awful. It turns out even that history is more complicated, where some Mongol princes come into the Russian court and intermarry, et cetera, and convert. By the way, many of you may recall that in this prison exchange last, I think, August, one of a Russian liberal opposition, a member who will call himself, I'm a member of the liberal opposition, who had been imprisoned for criticizing the government and given a sentence of 25 years. He also has been opposing Putin's government for years and was once poisoned and paralyzed in the way that the Russian government attempted to poison Alexei Navalny. The Russian government did succeed in murdering Navalny, and we're coming up on a year of his death. But at any rate, Vladimir Kara-Murza was also subjected to that kind of behavior. Vladimir Kara-Murza is from a family that is descendant from Genghis Khan and joined the Muscovite state in the 15th century. And so he traces his family very, very far back in time and is devoting his life at great risk to his own life to trying to set Russia on a different track. At any rate, so if Elizaveta is coming into this reign where if Elizaveta is coming into power, presiding over an empire that has a strong awareness of the different confessions, and pretty much the way they did it, and I write about this in my first book, is like, we are the state and we are Orthodox and it is our job to police orthodoxy, but we don't enforce orthodoxy on others. Like, conversion needs to be voluntary. And certainly in Siberia, Peter was like, oh my God, don't convert those people to Orthodoxy, because if they're Orthodox, then we can't force them to give us fur tribute. And I would rather have fur tribute than more souls for Orthodoxy. So, the state takes a very tempered approach to all this. And Elizaveta is more like, no. And she forces communities of Muslims to emigrate against their will. She deports essentially some people into Persia, and there's expulsions. She has mosques burned down. Whereas in my first book, I came across documents in Siberia where we're like, we don't like all this call to prayer. Those Muslims, they're shouting out their prayers and it's really irritating and it's right near the Orthodox Church and that just isn't right. And the state writes back, actually, this is to the town of Berezov, a document from, I think, 1701. That's the same town that Menshikov died in. The state writes back, do not antagonize these populations. I mean, maybe if the mosque happens to burn down, you can try and build it farther away, but don't instigate anything. They've been here for a long time. and we don't want problems. So that was sort of the state's approach. Um, and Elizaveta takes a harder line. She's involved in some wars. I list them up here. We don't really need to go into that. But let's see, how are we doing? We just have a little bit more time. Oh, yeah. So she rules for 2 decades. And then she makes peace with Sweden. She fights the War of the Austrian Succession. She fights the 7 Years' War. This one's kind of big in that Russia's fighting against Prussia in this war, and a lot of lives and treasure are lost in this war. And then she needs to pass. She doesn't have official issue. She has a storied love life, actually, that unfortunately we won't go into at all here, but she's not allowed to marry. She probably would have liked to. She may have secretly married, but officially, the kind of men that are helping her rule will not let her marry. So she also too needs to find an heir. And she chooses Peter III, who is, I'm not saying, a grandson of Peter I through those Baltic marriages, to be kind of quick. So she calls him to the court, and he's going to be the ruler. Let me, 1 second. Well, that anyway, she calls Peter. He moves to St. Petersburg. It's like, okay, you're going to be my heir. You're going to be the Tsar of Russia. Believe it or not, through marriages, he also has a claim to the Swedish throne, who Russia, spent 2 years fighting with. But such is the nature of marriages at this point. And so then Elizaveta needs to find a marriage for him. And she chooses this young woman, Catherine. But actually, she looked a little bit closer to this when Elizaveta first engages her. So Elizaveta chooses Peter. Peter was the nephew. So Elizaveta had that sister, Anna Petrovna, also daughter of Peter, and she was the only other child of Peter and Catherine that lived into adulthood. And his mother died early, and his father died when he was 11, and he'd been raised in this, like, by mean people that bullied him, and he's like this kid of privilege, but he has these really mean tutors, in this Swedish environment where they're like, spare the rod, spoil the child. So he kind of had this awful upbringing where he's impulsive, he's lies, he's boastful, and he's just a spoiled, awful person, that is raised like without love and without kind of good structure, and without parents that love him. So he's born Charles Peter, and then she imports him, and she's like, all right, he's going to be the next czar. Now I need to find him a wife. And basically it's like, put out the word, and a portrait is delivered to her of this woman, Catherine. And Elizaveta liked the look of him. And she liked the look of him because she had actually had a chance to marry her relative, Catherine's, who will become Catherine's. Her name was Sophie's relative. But he had gotten sick and passed away, and Elizaveta was quite heartbroken about it. She had wanted to get married someday. And so it's quite likely that she saw the resemblance of her deceased betrothed in the portrait of Sophie. And so she liked her. Catherine was brought to St. Petersburg. Sorry, her name is Sophie. Sophie is born she's born in April 1721 in Stettin. That is then Prussia, but is now Poland. Here, I'll show you a picture on the map. So here's kind of Poland, and Catherine is from right around up here, right? This is where Sophie, and she is born. She's the daughter of a minor prince. Her the Anhaltserbst, and sorry. So her mom is this princess whose brother had been betrothed to Elizaveta Petrovna. So kind of she sees the family resemblance. She's a little bit inclined. And so Catherine is sent for. So Sophie is sent for. She is immediately, well, not immediately, but she'll need to convert from Lutheranism to Orthodoxy to marry the Russian Tsar. But she arrives and her mother is with her, and she would never see her father again. She arrives to the Russian court in 1744, and she makes a huge effort to impress Elizaveta. She understands where the power is. She learns Russian very, very well. By the time that she is married to Peter III, she can speak Russian better than he can. And so they get married, and then they live at the court for 9 years while Elizaveta is still the tsarina, but it's a pretty unhappy marriage. It's a pretty unhappy marriage. They don't have, he's deeply immature. They're married in 1744. Catherine, like, she pretty much arrives, learns Russian, converts to Orthodoxy, then gets married. All these amazing changes happening for this, young 15-year-old girl. Her mother is with her at court, but then her mother will piss off Elizaveta, and Elizaveta will send her mother away, and then she's really on her own. And so she is really in foreign territory, and it's said that this is where Catherine really learns to pay close attention to politics and hold her cards close to her chest and learn how to survive in this court. Remember, like holes in the wall and Anna Ioannova's reign, where like a careless conversation gets people that thought they lived a life of privilege sent to Siberia, right? That's sort of the, hornet's nest of court that she is dropping into. And she manages to navigate it where a whole lot of people end up thinking she's solid, while meanwhile, her husband, Peter, hugely alienates people. I mean, we can have some sympathy for his horrible upbringing, but he was major, major norm buster. Like one small detail that may be somewhat telling. At the funeral of Elizaveta Petrovna, so a state funeral is a really big deal, and you have a procession of all the, most important people of state or whatnot. And at this procession of his aunt, who has, brought him to the halls of power, related to him, has ruled for 2 decades. At her funeral, he thought he would play this little game where he would like go so creepingly slowly in the procession that all the like horses and other carriages behind him are like jamming up and they can't proceed properly. And then he would like run ahead and scoot. So then they're like trying to catch up, and you have like some very elderly, venerated people in the procession, and so he's just like making things difficult, but he likes that. He's like, I'm a norm buster and I'm powerful and I can do whatever I want. And so, well, to make a long story short, he can't. He also, after so many lives and treasure have been fought, fighting Prussia in the 7 Years' War, he decides we're going to make a quick peace. And by the way, I'm such a fan of things Prussian that I'm going to show up to court and I'm going to put my favorite retinue in really Prussian-like uniforms. This too rubs people very much the wrong way. And so to make a long story short, a coup is organized where he is murdered and Catherine comes to the throne. All right, that was a lot of 18th century stuff. We're going to stop there. And on Thursday, come and we're going to talk about what you've gotten out of this Children of 18. We won't get to the Kivelson Sunni reading. Do read that. We'll just talk about it